What happened to the surviving employees that were in the WTC buildings? Local 3 NYC electrician here. I became a basket case for over 2 years. Eventually put down the bottle and found employment away from NYC. Still can't watch documentaries about it. Don't like to talk about it. Lost more than my mind that day. Documentaries are a trigger for flashbacks for me too. That smell. Be well. My grandparents' neighbors were a nice couple. They were in their 40s with 2 kids. Our town is about 2 hours away from NYC and the father would travel into work every day whereas the mother taught across the street at the middle school. I was in her class when we found out about the attacks. She immediately fell to the ground and went pale. We were all frightened, not knowing what to do or say. Most of us knew he worked in the towers. Small town. One of the kids in my class ran to the phone to call the principal. Before he even got off the phone, her husband came bursting into the room with his pajamas on yelling, "I didn't go in. I didn't go in. I'm sick." I stayed home sick. It was the craziest thing I've ever seen up to that point. To answer your questions, I really can't because his whole department was killed, minus a few employees. He began working at the local subway. He just wanted a stress-free job, close to his family. I want to know the mindset of someone that worked in the towers but stayed home sick or was running late. I couldn't even imagine what they were thinking. My uncle was a survivor from the second tower that got hit. Did the survivors lose their jobs? Because so many people from his office died. He was on the 80th story or so, but left the building when the first one was hit. The company that he worked for closed their NY branch, so some people did lose their jobs. Were they transferred to a different office? He was transferred to their London office. Did they take long, unpaid vacations? His wife was really traumatized by the event. They had an apartment with a view of the NY skyline, so she watched the entire thing go down. She was panicking, seeing her husband's office demolished, and couldn't get a hold of him. And he was unable to get home because everything was closed down. For about 24 hours, she thought he was dead. So, to recuperate, they did take some time off and just traveled for a bit. Hats off to your uncle. My dad was in the first building, 71st floor. He works for the Port Authority, which recently opened an office in Jersey City. Before that opened, he was working at Newark Airport. I guess they have offices there as well. He went back to work the day after 9/11. My mom was freaking out telling him to stay home, and he said tomorrow is a Wednesday, and I go to work on Wednesdays. I don't even think he knew at that point where he was going to go to work, but he just figured it out. It may have been a coping mechanism. I went to work the day after a tsunami wiped out my office. It was an attempt to keep things normal, in whatever small way possible. Work was not at all normal, but being there and sorting through debris made me feel like I was helping. And when everything is all gone to heck like that, helping a little feels good. At the time, I worked for a law firm that had just rented offices in Tower 2. They'd been there for less than a month or so. I think about 20-25 people worked in that branch. 5 people were killed on 9/11. The firm ended up setting up a new office space. I don't know what they offered to employees of the branch. My 9/11 story. Each branch kept copies of resumes for all the attorneys in the entire firm, no matter where they were based. A few months after, one of my bosses got a call that a pristine copy of his resume was found in the rubble. Each branch kept copies of resumes for all the attorneys in the entire firm, no matter where they were based. Yeah, resumes were all over the streets. You looked at them and wondered if the person got the job or was lucky enough to miss out. Kind of ghoulish to call and find out. I used to work for somebody that ran an investment firm in the building. He was out of town on business when the planes hit, but the 2 other founding members died along with 95% of staff. He was planning to retire, but instead rebuilt the firm. One of the coolest guys I know in so many ways. A close friend of mine worked in the North Tower. She was sick that morning and stayed home. She witnessed the second plane fly into the building. A few months later she moved to Texas and became a raging alcoholic. She refused any help or advice and continued her downward spiral. She lost a high-paying job, was jailed twice, DUI, and ended up working the lunch shift in a strip club. Whoa, I'm so sorry to hear that. I hope things get better for her. My dad worked for a co-located telco that had an office and lines running through the WTC. He was at another site a few blocks down, and he basically just started walking away when he saw the first plane hit. When the towers came down, there wasn't anything he could do. Nobody could call out because all the major telephone lines were trunk through the WTC, and when they went down, those links were destroyed. He worked through the next few days trying to bring up telecommunication service. His company was losing millions by the minute. Eventually he lost his job and was unemployed ever since. To my knowledge, a few friends were survivors. Lose job if their company kept a NY office. They had some time off as the office was being set up, and to get over the trauma, then returned to work in a new location. This was the experience of my friends. Government assistance no, because they were not unemployed at any point in time. The company paid them even during the time they were off working from home. Long unpaid vacation? No, the company did not have a NY office for a while, a couple of weeks, so they had time off, paid, while they waited. They did some work from home during this time, but they were anxious to get back to work. It seemed to me they just wanted to start to create a new normal. You did not ask, but I would say the greatest impact on survivors was the stress of going to funerals and memorial services, sometimes 3 or 4 in one day. There was the survivor's guilt, the stress of seeing the loved ones of their lost colleagues, and the constant focus on what they had experienced. They wanted to move on, but the whole world conspired to make them stay in that moment for far too long, in my opinion, based on conversations with them. My friend worked across the street. When the first plane hit, his boss told everyone to get back to work. He left and ended up saving someone's life when the tower collapsed. The person was in shock and standing in the middle of the street, staring at the building. He pulled the person out of the street into a nearby vestibule. He did not receive government assistance, and for a while would vomit every time a plane flew overhead. He lost his job and was working at a restaurant in Times Square for about 6 months afterwards. He ended up moving back to his hometown and eventually went back to school. Almost all of the deaths were people on the floors on and above the plane hits. On the floors below the plane hits, almost everyone got out successfully, so a lot of companies in the WTC had almost everyone working there survive. I worked in the Boston office of a company that had its NY offices on the lower floors of one of the towers. The only fatality we had was a man who refused to leave. He'd been there for the prior WTC bombing and figured he'd probably be fine. My father was in the North Tower when the first plane hit. He and 2 co-workers managed to save a few people on their floor and even offered to carry a guy in a wheelchair down the stairs, who politely declined. We found out later he died. My dad made it out safely and was on the ferry to NJ when the towers collapsed. But to answer your questions, he went to work the next day at another office in NJ. He mainly went in to make sure everyone made it home safe. His company eventually went bankrupt a couple years later because they insured some stuff that was related to the attacks and the claims depleted their reserves. He did take some time off afterwards and from that day never missed a single one of my or my siblings' games. No government assistance, but the company did give him and the other 2 co-workers who scanned the floor before leaving a nice little check. One of my former assistants, who went on to NYC to start her career, wasn't in the towers, but got to work late that day because of a subway switching problem. As she exited her stop, she saw a rain of papers coming down, and police were already there telling everyone to go back, get out, nothing to see. She saw the first tower building on fire, and didn't know what happened. So she went back home. When she got home, I think she lived in Flushing at the time, only then did she hear about what happened. Her office was hit on the first strike, and I think 28 out of 31 employees at her company were most likely killed instantly. The other 2 were also affected by the subway switch issues, and were late to work. She was pretty shaken up by it, not only the near miss due to being later, but survivor's remorse. She doesn't talk about it much, but she lives a normal life, got married a few years later, has kids. My uncle is an IT guy. He worked around the 80th floor of the South Tower in the 80s and 90s. After the 93 truck bombing attempt on the WTC, he grew scared of working so high up and decided to work in Building 9 of the WTC, which was the third building that collapsed on 9/11. A few weeks after 9/11, he transferred to a different company, a company on the 8th floor of a shorter building in Lower Manhattan. Now he works in a 4-story building in Greenwich Village. He's terrified of heights and terrified of planes, even though he used to be in the Air Force and still travels abroad often. Then my brother had a business trip in NYC on 9/11 and was crossing Washington Bridge around the time that the planes hit. Perhaps not as much as my uncle, but he was really traumatized. Everyone was. But everyone has to get back to work sometime, whether it's the next week or the next month. My uncle never talks about 9/11, though, and he refers to it as the World Financial Center, but never World Trade Center. My cousin worked on the 80th floor of the second tower to be hit. He commuted from New Jersey each day and on the 11th of September was running behind. He got out of the subway as the first tower was hit. The reason he was running late that day was his wife was starting her new job as a flight attendant. Another strange coincidence was my auntie visited them the year prior and he had given them a tour of the WTC. This was on the 11th of September, 2000. His office was relocated, although they lost quite a few employees. Him and his wife, she quit her job the day it happened. Took some time to deal with the emotional aspect. The worst thing for him was when he finally got out of New York and to where him and a lot of people who worked at the towers parked was seeing all the abandoned cars and then seeing them days later knowing that those people weren't coming back for them. The worst thing for him was when he finally got out of New York and to where him and a lot of people who worked at the towers parked was seeing all the abandoned cars and then seeing them days later knowing that those people weren't coming back for them. Dang. In all these years I never even considered that. Whoa. My neighbor worked in the towers and killed himself shortly after the attack. I was pretty young, but my mom said it might be because he lost his job. I couldn't imagine the trauma anyone would have to deal with after something like that happened. The heaviness of everything would appear to be too much. To answer your other questions, I did not get additional time off. With the exception of the 3 days immediately after the attack, did not receive government assistance, was temporarily relocated to Jersey, where I worked the graveyard shift. Also due to road train closures, the commute was roughly 2.5 hours each way. I lasted about a year before getting laid off and switching professions. I can speak to the workers at the Deutsche Bank building, which took significant damage. None of the survivors lost their jobs. They reported to work at one of the area disaster recovery facilities. Because of the gap between desks and workers, DB moved around a lot. For a few years, every few months meant another move until they could consolidate. I used to work at Deutsche Bank at 130 Liberty Street in M&A, and I heard that they were cutting staff before 9/11/01 and that it actually helped keep some people's jobs longer. I had already left for a job at 1 WTC by then, but had still kept in touch with former co-workers, especially after I got that day off, which was a Tuesday and Wednesday off. I had to go in on Thursday to rebuild the network infrastructure in a new location in Midtown. Fortunately for us, we had an off-site data center in New Jersey which we set up for Y2K 2 years earlier. My dad used to work on the 84th floor of the South Tower. Luckily he was late for work that day because he let 3 trains go by and stayed on the local train because he had a seat and wanted to read the paper that morning. After some time his company relocated to another location in Manhattan and he kept his job. I don't know how much the death of a bunch of his co-workers directly related to this, but he ended up leaving the company he worked at fairly soon after the relocation. I had never thought of the impact of all of the people attending so many funerals for fallen co-workers. For some reason that just hit me pretty hard. I was in 7th grade when it happened. We had a girl come into our class midway through the year from NY. She attended 26 funerals in the following 3 weeks after the attacks. Being on the West Coast, we were sheltered from it. I was still asleep when it happened. My uncle wasn't employed in the WTC, but he was a member of the FDNY. He told me that the days following, several businesses were shut down and helped rescue efforts. My uncle escaped Building 2. He worked for the Port Authority of NY and NJ. He did some work at their LaGuardia office but eventually left to seek a new career. I think this is the general life of most of the survivors. Seek some new distraction and try not to remember much. My English teacher was a chef on the restaurant Windows on the World at the time they fell. He said that he lost his job but was able to find one within a month because his employer wanted to help him. My brother's friend worked at the WTC. She was downstairs doing the office coffee run because she was the new girl who started on Monday the 10th. If I recall correctly, her office was on one of the floors that got hit. Story time. I worked for Deutsche Bank on 9/11. My office was directly across the street from the WTC. I think I got 3 days off before I was asked to work from their office in Jersey City. My job was effectively eliminated, however they kept me on board for about a year before laying me off. One of my favorite memories is in the days after the attack, an overzealous manager obtained permission from the NYFD to collect computer equipment that was left behind. Long story cut short, we were ordered to immediately head to the site. Experienced a 10 hours commute only to learn that all of the equipment had been destroyed. The manager was so fuming at the end of the ordeal that he began to stomp in place, screaming obscenities. Boarders wanted to reclaim the store safe. I don't believe they were allowed in to get it, although that building was standing on its own. My aunt worked locksmith. Just missed dying in the 1993 bombing, which killed all her colleagues. In 2001 she was off that day to bring her girlfriend to the doctor. She lost her job entirely but got workers' comp as well as VF money. She's our supervisor now, and being in security at WTC got her in the door. She took a few years off, some paid. I worked in the WTC North Tower 51st floor. We had about 80 employees and we relocated to Jersey City, which is now the permanent office. When I walked home that day, the first thing on my mind was, will I have a job next week? Thankfully, we got our act together quickly and after a few days we were rebuilding everything and were fully operational within a month. Whoa, this is actually a really good and unique question. It's one of those things you never think about, but once you think about you're surprised you don't know. What's weird too is that isn't not marked serious and no one has made a joke. My mom worked for a company whose HQ was in the towers. Workers worked from home until a new location was found. The company was ahead of the times in tech and had off-site backups so they could operate within days. The WTC collapse did drive office space prices through the roof in NYC with so many clients looking for space all at once. Now my dad didn't work in the towers, but he did see the first plane hit. He had just dropped me off at school and was on the bike path in NYC, right next to the World Financial Center when he saw the first plane hit. He immediately biked to my school, picked me up and took me home. We had family friends staying with us for about a week after. They lived about a block from the towers. Now in the aftermath of 9/11, he lost his job, which was at an ad agency in Lower Manhattan, maybe 10-15 blocks from the towers. While I know him losing his job had something to do with 9/11, I think it just had to do with the ad agency's lack of work and money following 9/11, rather than the incident itself. I vaguely remember, but times were tough and things were uncertain back then. My aunt worked at the Vista International Hotel just underneath the towers. She was able to get out before the towers collapsed. My cousin works for Morgan Stanley. I don't know which tower he worked in, but that day, he decided to take his daughter to her first day of school and go to work afterwards. As he was heading to work, the bus pulled up and the driver told him what happened. He had no idea what was going on until that moment. Today, he still works for them, but they moved the company to somewhere in Connecticut and wound up moving there because the commute was terrible. Used to live in New Jersey. Can't really say much about how it was with the WTC survivors specifically, but I know that nowadays it is standard practice for larger companies, the ones you would expect to have offices in the WTC, to have disaster recovery sites more or less close by. These sites are bare bones and out of the way, but allow employees to keep business operations afloat until the disaster blows over. The company I work for example, has an office in Manhattan and a doctor site in Jersey. I worked in the South Tower. We were relocated to temporary space in CT and eventually ended up in Midtown for a year. The company then returned home to the World Financial Center. We did not lose any employees. No government assistance. We were all enrolled in a health registry to track physical and mental health. We actually were actively back at work 1 week after in order to show that the company was functional. Nobody really survived that day. For some, the day never ended. It just got quieter in the background of our mind, but it's always there. The last words we spoke to them, the last actions we did with them, all the time we wasted on stupidity, the all-consuming helplessness that came in the following hours. Guilt, guilt, guilt. You either gave up on God completely or welcomed him into your life. For some, the person we became that day resembles nothing of who we were at 8:45 that morning. Guilt and regret is laced between every minute that makes up the hours of our days. That day was an infection that wiped away all the days that came before it. We're immune to the future because what used to matter before that day just simply stopped mattering. Employment, promotions, education, yeah, we still live the life we're supposed to live on the outside because others are watching us. It makes them feel better to believe we're normal again. But for some, the most pressing issue in our lives is the hope that one day we'll get a call telling us that they finally found some sort of human remain of her, and we now have something to put inside the empty coffin we buried. I think I've commented on a post of yours about this before, but what you said here really sounds like it came straight out of my heart and mind. Just wanted to send love and commiseration, although I know sometimes that's the last thing that's wanted, from someone who wishes there was a way to be 12 again and have her back. My dad worked on the 64th floor. He happened to be doing an audit somewhere else that day, but his office was gone and many people he knew never made it out. He worked from a temp office for a bit, then they offered him a great early retirement package. It really ruined him in a lot of ways. He spent a decade just kind of lost and sad and purposeless. He's doing a lot better in the last few years, but I'll never forget just watching him drift as I moved into adulthood. Survivor guilt. It's a nasty thing. My father's aunt worked in Building 7. I don't know all the details because it's not something you want to ask a person about too much. She worked there in real estate, but was late to work when all heck broke loose. As far as I'm aware, none of her co-workers died. That's as far as I know about what happened, but she now lives in Los Angeles. This is just a guess, but I'm sure they just relocated their business. I'm glad to hear that all these people survived. My boyfriend's uncle godfather was a firefighter who went in the second tower. He was last seen on the 5th floor, but then was never found again. Watching the building collapse down to the ground gives me a sick feeling in my stomach. Knowing he was in that 5th floor, it's like watching him die. We can only hope that it was a quick and painless. Maybe he was unconscious from the smoke. He left his 2 young children and wife behind. She remarried his friend who was also a firefighter. That was a common thing for some reason. Wives of police officers or firefighters that remarried in the same department. As I recall the story, my aunt's BFF's husband worked in them and worked the days when the bomb went off in 1993 and on 9/11. His office was right above where the 93 bomb went off, and although he didn't usually go out for lunch, he did that day, which was what saved him then. The second time, he made it out and walked to his wife's office, all covered in ash. He's retired now. He's a super sweet fellow. I'm so glad he made it. I know one lady who worked in Building 7. I think that was the last one to collapse. She worked for an insurance company and had the flu the day of the attacks. It turns out during 2001 Manhattan Island had a huge office space surplus, so that particular company had no trouble at all finding another location. One of my dad's good friends worked in the North Tower, not sure what floor. On the 9th of October 2011, he was outside and ended up talking with his neighbor, who told him that he should seriously consider not going to work the next day. He ended up staying home and immediately called the police when he saw what had happened. His neighbor's house was completely cleared out when the police got there. Bullshit. I work for a corporation who had a whole office at the WTC. I can confirm that majority of the office branch there survived, and they were compensated and given counseling and free insurance for quite some time after it happened. They eventually just moved that branch to a different part of NYC and hired new people. They also gave the survivors an opportunity to have their jobs back. I'm not sure how many of them took it. This is kind of off topic, but it relates to the companies in the WTC. After 9/11, my great aunt donated some money to one of the companies that lost a lot of its employees' workspace. She got a letter back a little while later thanking her for her donation, and if she would donate more. She was shocked. My father worked at the Guggenheim Museum at the time, and he was laid off as a result of the WTC attacks. Apparently tourism to NYC nosedived and the museum lost tons and tons of revenue. My mother-in-law served as the key custodian for the South Tower and was the only one who made it off her floor alive. Pretty traumatic experience for her. Her post served as the call center for the building, and she got many calls from those trapped above the impact area asking for help. I can't imagine what it feels like to be the last person many people ask for help. To add to that, days after the attack, many of her co-workers' relatives would call her asking if she had seen their loved ones. She knew they were all dead. Did she return to work? Nope. She eventually worked for CNN. I believe some survivors received some sort of settlement. She has pretty bad episodes when on the subway and a bad back from being thrown into a desk when UA-175 hit the South Tower. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.